Thank you for all that are attending today and interested in learning more about the Nunatsiavut government and our data and information management project. We have a number of slides. I will go off script a little bit just to give you a bit more information. I hope that we can meet the 45 minutes. We may be a little bit quicker or we may be a little bit longer. It's hard to say once you start talking about these type of things. Just to let you know, by no means am I a data or information management queen, or I don't have really any background in this particular area. So we are kind of learning as we go, but certainly willing to share what we've learned along the way and give you some background into how we got to where we are. Julia, next slide. So just for the overall presentation, we're going to provide some background on the Nunatsiavut government. I'm not sure if everyone knows exactly where we are or when we were created. Some information on the background of data and information management for the NG. How we got to the environmental data scan and physical electronic data. We did 2 RFPs, so that was one of them. And then the other one was the development of a data governance framework. And then we'll pull in Firelight, who was a successful organization to do this work for us. And we're so excited and happy they joined us because they've been doing phenomenal. And poor Janice and I would never have been able to do all this without them. So you'll get to see some of the work that they've done to date. And then we'll just touch base on what our next steps are in the process. Julia? If I go too fast, just let me know. I tend to get excited and I can babble quite a lot. So just let me know if I'm going too fast. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Nunatsiavut government, we were established in 2005 following the finalization of the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement. This initially started with our Labrador Inuit Association, and they worked for over 30 years in order to get our land claim signed and agreed upon. With that, it also included self-government. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with our other Inuit regions within Canada, but it's Inuvialuit, Nunavut, Nunavik, and then us, the Nunatsiavut. And we're actually the first of our 4 Inuit land claim agreements that actually obtain self-government. So we're considered a regional Inuit government within the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, but a lot of our work works directly with the federal government. We have authority over many areas such as health, education, housing, culture, language, justice, and community matters. However, we haven't taken all those pieces down from the provincial government yet. The current one that we're working on is CSSD, which is Child, Youth, and Family Services. That's the first one we're really working towards bringing down under our own authority. Julia? So within our government, we have 7 different departments that do 7 different things or oversee 7 different things. So we have the Nunatsiavut Secretariat, who is the President's office. They're responsible for all of our assembly documentation, our executive council meetings, and various other internal operations, as well as partnerships or meetings with provincial or federal departments. We have Nunatsiavut Affairs. They oversee housing, transportation, justice, and those type of areas. Health and social development, that's probably our biggest department within Nunatsiavut government. And they oversee all of our healthcare needs, public health, a lot of youth programs as well, family connections programs, those type of things. They also work with Labrador Grenfell Health in regards to our clinics on the coast. Then we have education and economic development, and they kind of speak for themselves. So they oversee our education area, our post-secondary support program, economic development, so new businesses, Inuit businesses that want to develop. They oversee our Voisey's Bay project as well. Lands and natural resources, pretty much self-explanatory as well. So they take care of the environment, our renewable resources, non-renewable resources, our mammals. We have an environmental act that we've developed since we became a government. So they oversee that as well in the implementation. Anybody that wants to do research in their region also has to go through an approval process. So they oversee that. Like a lot of other regions, I'm sure, and First Nations, Métis, Inuit groups, I'm sure you've had a lot of research being done in your area with your people without really seeing the results of those research. So this is our way of ensuring that nothing happens in our region without our consent. And also within that application process that they have to go through, they also have to come back and present the results to community so that there is that full circle. So that's another important area under lands and natural resources. Under my division, language, culture, and tourism, we oversee all of our language files, doing various cultural programming. We oversee the tourism strategy, and also under us falls archaeology as well. And anything that happens in our region also has to have an archaeology permit as well. So if people are doing land use applications or what have you, it's normally triggered then to go to our archaeology division, and they'll review that and pass it or let them know if there's any archaeological sites in that area. So a lot happening within there. And then last but not least, but probably the most important, is the finance, human resource, and information technology department. So that one kind of speaks for itself. But just to highlight here, in regards to information technology, we don't specifically have a person that works on data and information management. We do have Janice, who does a lot of things with SharePoint, and we also have 3 other staff within information technology, but they're more around the equipment, ensuring that the servers are working properly, purchasing of new equipment. So, you know, when you really look at the data and information management piece, while different people within these 7 departments do their kind of own thing, we don't have like a unified system. Just for an example, like with our Health and Social Development Department, they actually have to follow Health Canada Act in regards to how they, you know, save their information, how they access their information, those kinds of things. And then just another example, archaeology also has their kind of system, and we have to follow the province of Newfoundland and Labrador's way of saving information, and all the different pieces that fall under that. So while there's not one unified system currently, there are pockets within those departments that have their own systems, like finance also has their own system in regards to how long they need to save their information, what types of information they need to save. So while there isn't one individual person, all these departments kind of save and do things in their own ways. Julia? So I'm just pointing out where our locations are so you can understand the capacity issues, but also how cumbersome and difficult this project could actually be. And so we have various locations within Nunatsiavut and outside for offices. So here in Nain is the administrative hub. While we have the administrative building, we also have a building for DHSD. We also have our Aluswak, which is our culture center. We have our youth center and some other offices within within Nain as well. Then in Hopedale, which is our capital, we also have That's where our assembly is. So there's the assembly building. There's also DHSD offices there as well. We have language staff there as well, a language nest. So you can see the buildings and possibly the information, paper trails piling up, cabinets. Makovic, our Department of Education that was located in St. John's, Newfoundland, just got moved to Makovic within the last 2 years, I believe. So all of their information is now in Makovic. And there's also various offices as well that cover Nunatsiavut affairs. We have our arts program coordinator there and various other staff as well. In Postville, it's a bit smaller, and we have our NG office there, and there's a DHSD office. Rigolet, same kind of thing. Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Upper Lake Melville. So we have 2 big offices there, one on Kellen Drive and another on Hillcrest. And that's a lot of our DHSD staff and our finance staff, and a number of our IT staff and HR staff as well. And then we do have an office in Northwest River. I believe it's our conservation officer. And there is a error there. We've talked about Upper Lake Melville twice, but I just wanted to give you an idea. And all of these communities, from if you go Happy Valley, Goose Bay, and then up your list, it's all fly-in communities, or by boat in the summertime. In the wintertime, it's still fly in, fly out, but a lot of people go by Skidoo as well. So I just wanted to point out like the number of different offices that we have within these particular places. The population overall, Nain is the biggest at about, I think it's a bit more now since the new census has come out. There was an error, so I think they were fixing it. I haven't seen that actual new number yet, but it was about 1,300. Hopedale, you're looking at about 700 and something. Makovic, 500. Postville, you're looking at about maybe 200. And Rigolet, you're looking at probably around the same as Postville, probably 200 to 300. Happy Valley, Goose Bay is a lot bigger. So population size is fairly small, but definitely a busy group. Julia. So just coming from that, so just wanted to give you an idea of where our offices are. And, you know, it's not like I can just run down the road and talk to another office building. I either have to fly there, or now with new teams and those things, it's a little bit easier. But in regards to the physical paper trail or those kinds of things, it's hard to know where everything is unless you actually go to all these communities and see it. So that was one of our challenges at the beginning before we started this particular project. So you might be asking, before I get into this particular slide, you might be asking, why in the world is the Department of Language, Culture, and Tourism overseeing such a project for the whole of government? So just to give you a little bit of background, when I started here in 2016, we were involved in a SHRC program that was called Tradition and Transitions. And it was a big cultural project along with various research projects. So as I took over the position, I started asking, okay, like what am I expecting at the end of this particular project? And what was told to me was, you're going to get thousands and thousands of mega data. And I was like, what is mega data? I didn't know what mega data was. So they explained that to me, and they said there's going to be videos, there's going to be voices, recordings, like a whole gamut of information that's going to come our way. So as keen as I am, I went to our IT department at that time and the head of the IT department and said, hey, like through this project, I've become aware that we're going to get all this information that's traditionally ours, and that has also been developed through this Tradition and Transition project. I said, so what do I do with it? And that ignited a really long conversation around how the Nunatsiavut government has come into place since 2005, but we haven't actually developed any unified naming systems, saving systems, access, any of those kinds of things as an actual government. As noted prior, various departments had their own ways of doing things with certain information, but we don't have anything overall for NG. So I said, okay, so what do I do? And he said, we need to start a committee. And so this is where this slide comes from. So from that discussion, we felt that we needed to actually have an internal information management committee that would comprise of an individual that was chosen by the director or deputy minister to sit on that particular committee. And then our hope was that this committee would sit down and discuss exactly like what we need to do, where to start. So that was initiated in 2019, and it was only supposed to be for a 2-year term, but it's 2022 and we're still going. We're moved forward a lot in the last few years, but more so probably I would say in the last year. So that committee has been developed with the terms of reference, and the goal was to figure out what we needed to do, where we needed to start as a government in developing an information management framework, looking at creating policies, and how to do a scan of all of NG's data, considering it's all over the place, it's in different communities and in different buildings. Next slide, Julia. So as mentioned, we didn't make much progress at the beginning because it just seemed so huge. Like the whole project was just, where do we start? Do we start at the environmental scan? Do we start at developing policies or procedures? Do we start with naming systems? How are we going to know where everything is, and how are people saving that information? How long are they keeping it? And also, if we are developing things, then this whole change management piece, how does that work? So it was really timely when we got on this SGIG project and we started developing that Indigenous toolkit, because it helped Janice and I to really start focusing and saying, okay, like I think we're getting an idea of where we are and what we need to do. We also had a great colleague of ours that worked with Inuit Teparit Kanatame, which is our national Inuit organization in Ottawa. And her name was Anita Cora. And she really helped because she had worked here years ago trying to develop a library, I think. So she had a really good understanding of some of the pieces that we were struggling with. And she has a background in library and data information management as well. So she gave us some really good feedback on where we could even start looking. So as the Information Management Committee started talking more and gathering a little bit more information, we looked at the possibility of 2 requests for proposals. Now, we've been able to earmark some funds that we received through the federal government for this particular piece. So that enabled us to put out the 2 RFPs. Of course, with the request for proposals, they do have to go through our whole internal management process. So it did go through that process. Our ministers and our deputy ministers are all aware of this particular project and how it's moving forward. So, I mean, this was great. So then we moved into the 2 RFPs. Julia? So the first one was for electronic environmental data scan of physical and electronic data. So as shown earlier on the other slide, all the different communities, of course, have paper trails. They have electronic data, but we didn't know where people were storing things, how they were storing it, if it was accessible, if they were in locked cabinets, if they were on hard drives, USBs, you name it. We didn't know. So we did put out an RFP for an external consultant to complete the environmental scan of our current electronic and physical data assets. So we put that RFP out in July, and Firelight, of course, was a successful company, and we notified them in September. With our RFP process internally, we have to have it posted for at least a month to be able to give sufficient time for companies to put their applications in. So just so you have a bit of a timeline there in regards to our RFP process. Julia? So I think I kind of touched on a lot of these already. So the objective of this particular RFP was to do the environmental scan, because one of the key things we had talked about as an information management group was, okay, we know we have a lot of data, but we don't know where it is. So how can we assess it? How can we determine if we're saving things properly? How do we know if we're getting rid of information properly? The security aspects as well. How do you know any of that stuff if you don't know where the information currently is? So within this RFP, that was one of the tasks. And also to identify the risks associated with the data and how it's being secured, or if it's used improperly or properly, recommendations on data storage, the security piece, and management of data assets. And then hopefully recommendations on locations where each data set is being stored. Okay. So that was the first RFP. And then of course, as we were thinking through this process, once we had an idea where all this data was and what we were or weren't doing with it, what comes next? So like we needed a framework for us to have an idea of what we needed to do once we know all this information is. What kind of things do we need to have in place? So that was the second part of the RFP. So it was to develop this whole data governance framework for us. Still keeping in mind that we're still constantly looking back at this Indigenous toolkit to help us through this process. Janice and I, we really learned a lot through that process too. So I want to thank everyone through this SGIG that worked really diligently on that particular piece as well, because it certainly has helped us to figure out what we need to be doing. So the development of the data governance framework, and then also we hold a lot of significant amounts of data, and we need to ensure that it's governed properly. So as I mentioned, we do have the Department of Health and Social Development. So there's a lot of personal information in a lot of their programming files. And the work that they do with our beneficiaries. So we need to make sure that that data is governed appropriately. As I mentioned, they do have to follow the Health Canada Act in regards to their information management. But if we're wanting to bring this more into overall government aspect, it's even just knowing how they're doing that so that we're aware, okay, they have a process, perfect. What is that process? So we know exactly what that is. And then can others kind of follow that same process within an NG framework? Or, it's what comes out of all this work that will help develop this framework. And then it's also just to help staff as they move forward on these things as well. So some of the key deliverables for the project, as noted here below, is a strategic document outlining a data governance framework, and it would include 3 sections. The foundation, which would be the vision, principles, and objectives, like any normal kind of strategy. Next slide. Data governance, so decision-making structures, defining team roles, accountability, laws and policies, internal and external relationships, data retention policies. Next slide. And the third component is the data management. So storing and protecting data, naming data, managing data quality, and of course, as mentioned earlier too, the data lifecycle. So how long are we keeping information for, which I know within finance, I think there's a 7-year hold that they have to keep their information for, but are there other life cycles within our government that we're currently using? And how do we look at framing that for the overall government? Just as an additional piece to this work as well, just to highlight here, I mentioned our national Inuit organization, Inuit Teparit Kanatame. We're also working with them. They're looking at a national Inuit data strategy. So while we're doing this work, we're also working with them on that development of a national Inuit data strategy. So it's quite timely because a lot of the stuff that we're currently doing is actually helping us within that framework as well. So we're super glad that we're kind of linking the two at this time as well. It's kind of saving a little bit on the work side because we're getting some of this work through Firelight as well. So it's been timely that way. Thanks. Julia? So the data governance framework is to include statements of roles and responsibilities. And some of these things, Julia and Beverly will go through a little bit more in depth in the next part of the presentation as well. The strategic document will include goals and are linked to actions, and progress towards these goals will be measured with appropriate methodologies. The creation of an action plan as defined in one with the organization's business strategy and objectives, and progress reports on the development of the data governance framework. So we had a fantastic meeting with Firelight last week, I think it is. Time's going so fast, it's hard to keep up with everything. And they did a wonderful presentation as to what they've done to date, where they currently are, and what our next steps are. And as I mentioned, you know, human capacity, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, is quite difficult when you're taking on big projects like this. So if you're looking at doing something like this, I would really highly recommend looking at the possibility of hiring outside consultants that are familiar with this, because it certainly takes a lot of stress off your shoulders. If you're like me and you're not a data information person, you kind of have the big picture, the strategic thinking piece, but not the intricate pieces of how it all works. So I would certainly highly recommend getting support if and when you can. Next slide. Okay, so enough of me jibber jabbering. I'll pass it over to Julia and Firelight.
Thank you, Belinda. So about Firelight, we were founded in 2009 by a board of directors with the aim of providing services specifically tailored to supporting the rights and interests of Indigenous and local communities in Canada and beyond. Over the past couple of years, we've grown quite a lot. We're now at 70 plus employees across our offices in Squamish, Capilano 5 Reserve, or the West Vancouver, Vancouver, Victoria, and Edmonton. And we now have a remote office out in Toronto as well. So we're really growing, and all those little points on the map just show some of the communities we have worked with across Canada. Delving into our work with Nunatsiavut government, as Belinda mentioned, there was 2 RFPs. One is the environment scan, and the second was the data management framework. For the remainder of the presentation, I'm just going to group them as phases. So phase 1 with the environment scan, phase 2 the data management framework. As Belinda mentioned, also, we presented last week on our work on the first phase, and today we'll also present a little bit on where we're going on the phase 2, but there's no results really to present yet on phase 2, but we'll just speak a little bit about the methods we're going to apply and kind of the timeline and workflows around that. So in terms of the environment scan, Belinda did a great job kind of explaining the scope of that work, so I won't delve too much into it, but some of the outcomes that came from it was a inventory of all physical and electronic data assets or data holdings. So, that could be a banker box of files or floppy disks we found in the main administration office when we went up and traveled there. And it also could include a online data set in a spreadsheet or an actual relational database management system itself. So that was a really long journey for us to kind of map out essentially all the data holdings and then kind of look at the whole data life cycle with all the different departments and the divisions within each department and how they operate and handle information and data. Beverly in the next slide will give a deeper dive into how we actually went about understanding the sources of information, who the owners of the information are, how they currently store the information, whether it's sensitive or confidential information to non-sensitive information, and how that information was shared to internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders. From the inventorying and subsequent data mapping diagrams that show the information flows and data life cycles, we led to a data management action plan, which was kind of the final output for the environment scan. And the intent of that was really to break down with timelines on how we want to move forward to actually fulfilling the goals of the data management framework in relation to the outcomes of the environment scan. In terms of the data management framework, which I'll speak a bit to today, we are working on kind of classifying the information we compiled in the inventory into different themes, as well as into different security levels. We're still determining how we want to actually define those themes or those security levels. So that's something we can maybe discuss later today. We also are working on defining clear roles and responsibilities to ensure accountability of the data management framework itself. And then lastly, of course, is the protocols, guidelines that will on those data life cycles in relation to those defined classifications and roles and responsibilities. So with that, I'll pass it to Beverly quickly to speak on our first phase, the environment scan.
Thanks, Julia. So I will speak a bit to the phase one, the environment scan. We began by reviewing internal resources. So before we carried out the virtual interviews as well as the focus groups, we looked at HR resources like organizational charts and as well as results from existing surveys on data management. And this was so that we could frame the interviews and the surveys and ultimately data inventory and mapping diagrams that we created as part of this project. So for the virtual interviews and the focus groups, we met with about 58 participants over Zoom meetings for a 1 hour, topic specific or domain specific conversation. And participation was also carried out through sending out emails and corresponding over the Microsoft Teams platform. And scheduling was coordinated via Calendly to ensure that I was able to meet together. And the questions were developed around aspects related to data storage, management, governance, access, security, as well as the importance of Labrador Inuit culture and values integrated into management and governance. The online survey was also reflecting questions that we had created for the interviews, and we had approximately 52 responses. And these questions were asked between April and September. In the first week of July, Julia and I had the honor of going to visit approximately 30 staff up in Nunatsiavut, and we visited the main administration building as well as the research buildings. And we also went to Goose Bay to visit their 2 offices over there. And this was to get an overview of the inventory that needed to be documented. We looked at a lot of different storage areas, and this was really to get a sense of the work ahead. And this led us to creating a really large inventory document as well as mapping diagrams to visualize the flow of data management as it currently is, and where bottlenecks and sort of security risks might be. On the next slide, I'll sort of talk a bit more about that. So this is a template for how the data mapping diagrams were created. And as you can see, they're a really helpful visual tool, which we shared with NG staff and different teams and divisions to sort of visualize how data and information was moving throughout the organization. And its main characteristics were to identify where security risks were or bottlenecks were, or whether there was a need for digitization for any physical data. So yeah, I'll pass it back to Julia to speak more about phase 2.
Thanks, Beverly. And I just want to add to, in reflection of what Belinda mentioned before about all the offices being distributed across Nunatsiavut. And we had the honor, as Beverly mentioned, to get to go to Nain and Happy Valley Goose Bay to go to some of the offices there to do a review of the physical assets. Unfortunately, though, we weren't able to travel to some of the other communities just given accommodations and availability. And I think that's something to reflect on in this case, because certainly being physically there would have been important to document some of those physical assets. However, through our virtual engagements and online engagements, and we were able to adapt through communicating on their enterprise Microsoft Teams platform to really make sure we still are getting as best coverage as possible for that data inventory and the subsequent mapping diagrams. Great, so going into phase 2 now, for the data management framework, as mentioned, the outcomes of that phase 1 was to define roles, responsibilities, data classifications, and as well the protocol and guidelines on the entire data lifecycle. And what I meant by the protocols and guidelines for the entire data lifecycle is protocols on the creation of sensitive to non-sensitive information, how that information is collected, processed, masking techniques to encrypting techniques, how the information is stored, whether it's local on an on-premise server to in the cloud, which is a growing interest and need across a lot of governing bodies. Also versioning control, archiving, offboarding. One of our huge highlights that came from our engagement with staff was there wasn't even any guidelines on if the staff's leaving, how can we make sure the information they've compiled over the years is retained and transferred to new staff so that there's not a risk of loss of information. And I want to emphasize on that last bullet I have is cloud versus local, and all of the development of our data management framework now, we really want to make sure there's a distinction between certain management guidelines and protocols around how information is stored on the cloud, and in this case for Nunatsiavut government, it's Microsoft's cloud environment or Azure too, and then also how files and information be stored locally in your office, in filing cabinet, to a storage room, to your workstation or your laptop or your own server that you might have on premise as well. So in terms of the roles and responsibilities, these are the who or the role. It does what, that is the responsibility of the information management. So the roles and responsibilities are very important because they define who is accountable for implementing, in this case, the data management framework. And so our goal was to help frame the protocols and guidelines in reflection of these roles and responsibilities. So we've in the process of kind of defining these, and our plan is to have a workshop with the NG Information Management Committee to make sure we're all in agreement on these roles and responsibilities. So I want to emphasize these right now are draft. They're not set in stone by any means, but the idea is for us to kind of think of, who's going to be the individuals responsible for the implementation of the framework, who's responsible for making sure there's compliance of the framework, who's responsible for following the guidelines generally on the day-to-day, and who's accessing and using that information as well. So we've come up right now with kind of these 4 groupings: data leaders, stewards, owner, admin, or custodians, and then users as well. And you can see below, we've kind of highlighted some aspects and responsibilities for each of those roles for each of those roles. So for example, with the data leader, they would lead on the policies, guidelines, and protocols, and they would support the data steward on the implementation of the framework. So in a sense, the data leader would direct the data steward to oversee the implementation of the framework, guide on the management protocols and guidelines, and then also ensure the compliance of security protocols. For example, how non-sensitive information should be managed versus sensitive or confidential information. Then the stewards help guide the owners and administrators of the information, or custodians, and those are, staff who are working hands-on with the collection of information, the storage of that information. For example, the health and social development staff who have to take in referrals and manage that information, or the lands and natural resource that deal with the licensing of hunting activities. And those data stewards are the ones who control who access that information, whether it's internal stakeholders, other divisions who are partnered on the projects, or external stakeholders as well. And they would control that kind of access to the information depending on certain security levels, which we'll discuss in the next slide. So we've also started to kind of thematize, or kind of categorize or tag our the themes for the data inventory that we've compiled. And so as you see, we've kind of grouped them into human, cultural, operations, lands, and resources. And this falls similarly to the data governance framework from the Must-Win Information Solutions, Inc. And this is something we actually pulled from the toolkit. So thank you very much for that toolkit. And so what you can see in this kind of Venn diagram was to kind of emphasize, I was not necessarily say the messiness of the information, but more how information can have multiple purposes and uses. And so it's not easy to give it a distinct category or theme. In a sense, it can be tagged or associated with multiple different types of themes. And with that, it might have different security or protocols around it, depending on how that information is tagged. So as you can see here, we kind of started grouping some of the inventory holdings that we compiled into these different themes. So for example, with humans, we kind of have categorized all the health survey work, the health survey data they're collecting, or their social work information that they're starting to take ownership and control over. In terms of the cultural side, that's a large space for Belinda's team, and what they're collecting with archaeological work, as well as their tourism activities. Then, of course, the lands and resources, where it comes more on the licensing side, land use applications. There's a lot of environmental monitoring and survey programs right now where they're receiving lots of information, and they themselves are struggling with capacity and managing all that information themselves. And of course, a lot of that information they're getting from research can certainly benefit lots of different divisions within that government. So making sure that information that's coming back from researchers is also going right back to the divisions that might benefit from the outputs of that research activity. And then last but not least, as Belinda has mentioned, operations side. So that touches on all the purchase requests, orders, invoices that finance has to handle. And we should mention that on the finance side, they have multiple different teams to deal with that across Nunatsiavut. So that was a fun thing, trying to piece all that together as well. There's IT requests, recruitment applications from HR, legal recommendations and documentations from the legal services group, social media posts from communication. So all that gets grouped into the operations side. But as mentioned, it still significantly overlaps with all the other themes and groupings of information. As you'll also notice on this slide, you'll see kind of that yellow and blue circles. And this is to emphasize, beyond just classifying or organizing your information or tagging it into these different themes, we also want to make sure that there's security levels associated with that information. And we're still discussing what the best terminology or language to use around those classifications. We've kind of been leaning a little bit on the federal government right now on our end for protected AAB, or there's top secret. So that's something we're still working on, and that's something that will be an outcome of one of our workshops with the information management community. Last, to get this thing going, we have a couple steps. The first one is validation of our inventory. We presented it last week to Nunatsiavut, and now we want to make sure everything in there is as accurate as possible. Step 2, I think we're at. So as mentioned, in the subsequent weeks, we're going to be organizing a workshop to solidify those data classifications or themes, the security levels and roles and responsibilities. We're just picking a date right now. And then we will proceed with finalizing the protocols and guidelines around those defined classifications and roles and responsibilities. And with that, a key aspect for us is to ensure the guidelines are as easy to understand as possible. So we'll be developing a toolkit with nice visual graphics beyond just blocks of text describing all the roles and responsibilities. The goal of this is to really make sure that all the staff has something quick and readily available to them that they can review and refer to when they're ever in a case of uncertainty when it comes to storing or retaining any of their information. And then that would obviously lead to step 4, the release and showcase of that toolkit. And then step 5, of course, is training, which is actually teaching the staff and the committee around that toolkit and its usage, and making sure everyone feels comfortable and set to take on the data management framework and ensure its compliance with it as well. So thank you, and apologies again for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Julia. No problem at all. So this kind of just reiterates, I guess, the last slide that Julia had in regards to what our next steps are. I won't go through them again, but just to highlight them there. One of the key things for us as well is once we've done these workshops, it'll be important for myself and Janice then to bring this back to our executive council, which are made up of our ministers, just to give them an update as to where we are, and also what the next steps are in regards to the bigger piece. So as we're going through this, we're also noticing policies, probably legislation we need to create, those type of things. So we're slowly getting there, but we're a lot further ahead than what we have been. And it's thanks to Firelight, who's really helped us kind of pull all this together, and with their backgrounds in data and information management. I love that mapping diagram that Julia showed earlier. It really helped staff to kind of see visually where their information was going, where it was getting bottlenecked, and as a department to see where those bottlenecks are and where we need to start cleaning up. I'm really glad they didn't show any of our storage pictures. When they showed us the pictures last week on our presentation, I was like, oh my God, I'm so glad. It's unfortunate you guys had to go through it, but I'm so glad Janice and I didn't have to, because I would have just been overwhelmed. It's a lot of information in banker boxes, and there's shelves and shelves. So just really commend them on their work.